So welcome again to our briefing on recent political violence. We want to start with a land acknowledgement, and we do this to recognize the elders past, present, and emerging who have stewarded this land since time immemorial here on the banks of the Spokane River. We want to acknowledge the Spokane people, the interior Salish peoples who continue to resist ongoing colonization. To fight to sustain their land, culture, people, and language. And we want to encourage donations and support and followership toward the Salish School, toward Yoyot Spokane, toward the Urban Native Youth Organization as critical Indigenous leadership locations here in our community, and to follow the leadership of Indigenous people around the world. The point of the land acknowledgement is to take action, not merely to say words. We know our words are only as meaningful as our actions are. So we ask you to join us and take action in support of Indigenous leadership. For our PJAL's values and community agreements, we ask that everyone embody these in our behavior together in PJAL's spaces and anywhere else that you are as well. Respect, creating brave and welcoming space for all of us so that we can take action together on our shared goals. An anti-oppression commitment means that if oppressive behaviors or statements are made, we name it, we address it, we own it, and we learn from it. We support each other by sharing the air during discussions, speaking from our own experiences and perspectives, and learning from differences. We aim to be curious, to challenge our own assumptions, and to work from sound and current data. We seek to be aware of our choices so that we can make our choices consciously, not reactively. We evaluate together so that we can learn and improve. We focus, limit distractions in sidebars or in the chat, keep the chat focused in support of what's happening in the event to create a unified conversation, and clear agreements about roles, timeframe, actions, tasks, and relationship behaviors. So that's what we will be embodying today. And I want to share with you the statement that we shared in response to the shooting, the assassination attempt, and to announce this this briefing, which we're very excited to be able to offer. I'm going to bring this up and share with you. We recognize that at this moment, we continue to witness US-funded genocide in Gaza, and as we enter the height of the election season, many of us are feeling outrage, despair, fear, grief, resolve, and determination, while we would rather be enjoying the sun, the water, and the clean air in this beautiful summertime. In our PJALS community and in our broader movement, we're holding all this and more. With the recent assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, we're sharing a statement as well as hosting Kate Bitz to break down the reality of political violence, including this assassination attempt and the ripple effects in our region. In our PJALS community, we hold values of nonviolence and justice. We recognize, as laid out by Brazilian liberation theologist Dom Helder Câmara, violence builds up at 3 levels in a society. Primary violence is the everyday effect of structurally ingrained social injustice. This generates secondary violence, the revolt of the oppressed. And that in turn provokes tertiary violence, repression by the powerful to secure their privileged position. And so the spiral of violence tightens. We can understand the term political violence to simply mean violence for political goals. It exists at the institutional, systemic, and individual levels. We condemn political violence at the individual, institutional, and systemic levels. Political violence takes form in anti-trans legislation, in US-backed coups, in US war and US-funded occupation and genocide. White Christian nationalist rallies are threats of political violence. US history is built on the political violence of genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples and the subjugation of people. To echo writer and organizer Aaron Scott, who has a new book coming out, don't throw up your hands now. Study, organize, reflect, pray, cuss, laugh, rinse, repeat. In the face of political violence, Scott Nakagawa urges, participate in political and civic life. maintain a robust strategic engagement in political life. Consistent, uncompromising, nonviolent mobilization is the most effective at confronting authoritarian efforts. In casting our ballots, we protect the right to vote. In showing up in the streets, we protect the right to protest. In celebrating Pride, we protect the right to be ourselves fully in public. In making our voices heard, we protect the right to speak out. So I'm very happy now to be hosting Kate of Western States Center. Western States Center works nationwide to build a future where all people can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear. Their strategies include helping communities and civil society effectively respond to anti-democratic social movements. Kate is an expert on extremist groups and organized acts of violence in the Inland Northwest. And she's going to brief us on the context and realities of far-right responses to the assassination attempt and the context of political violence. We'll have a lot of opportunities to discuss the impact on our movement and how we can respond strategically as we go into the height of the 2024 election season. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Kate now and go into slideshow mode here. Take it away.
Thank you, Liz. So I just wanted to start out with a little bit of an update on what we do and don't know about the current situation around the shooting attempt on former President Trump. If we could go to the next slide. So I always like to start out any update on current events, including the advisories that Western States Center's team sometimes sends out to communities when they're facing an urgent potential threat or a situation. It's always important to start with what we do know and what we don't know. And I think in the context of the conversation that is happening about political violence across our country right now, it is important to know that, at least according to law enforcement analysis, the shooter's motive is still unclear, right? Bomb-making materials were found pretty quickly in his home, in his car. And it's also become clear that he was doing some searches about those materials. We also have known for just not even 48 hours now, I believe, that the shooter searched for both Biden and Trump campaign events online. In addition to the rally where he ended up committing this act, he was looking into the DNC in Chicago that will be happening in a few weeks. He was looking into other places where Biden was going to make campaign appearances. So again, multiple presidential candidates appear to have been on his radar here. As of last night, we're also aware that the shooter researched a previous school shooter and that shooter's parents. This is the case in which the parents of this shooter were actually prosecuted for not preventing his actions. So these are things that this shooter looked for online. What was not found was any information about his ideology, any chats in which he was discussing ideological or political views with others. We do not know much about this person's motive. And of course, because he can no longer speak for himself, there is a lot that we likely will never know. But I'm just laying out what we have so that we're all aware of this, right? Investigations are also beginning to show how such a thing could happen. Of course, in this country, we really look at prominent examples of violence as something to be taken seriously, whereas there are large portions of our population in this country who are regularly subject to gun violence. So in this particular case, people did immediately put together a lot of questions about how on earth could this possibly happen to such an important individual. What's becoming a bit clearer now is that there was a lack of coordination between federal and local law enforcement, and that the building that was scaled by the shooter was considered a potential problem ahead of time. So there you have it, a little bit about what we do and don't know. I'd now like to move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what the reaction has looked like from the groups that I see a lot of concern about in the chat. There was an immediate move to blame marginalized people. The New York Post published and then deleted claims that a Chinese American man was responsible for the shooting. It took people in the Stop AAPI Hate movement days to actually get an apology out of this paper for doing that. Currently, there are stolen pictures of transgender women circulating around the internet in support of false claims that the shooter was actually trans. So we are seeing a blame towards the transgender community. And of course, neo-Nazis have found a multitude of ways to blame shadowy Jewish conspiracies, whether some of them are thinking this was a conspiratorial attempt on Trump's life to stop him, or whether they are believing that this, in fact, was a staged attempt to boost Trump's profile because he is such a strong supporter of Israel. If you've seen any of my talks before, or if you've connected with Western State Center before, I think it's probably clear to you why that particular theme has come up. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. But let's move on to talk a little bit more about what the subsequent reactions looked like. There's also been a very quick pivot to attacking people who stand up to Trump as soon as more became known about the shooter. And it became rather clear that this person did not fit into any of those preferred narratives. Specifically, and I think rather troublingly for us and our movements, the language of threats to democracy has been speciously blamed for supposedly heightening tensions and divides in the United States. Of course, we know that that is nonsense. If we're talking about something being a threat to democracy or a person trying to move our country in a direction that would make it more difficult and dangerous for us to organize for justice, that is not a call to violent action. That is a call to civic action. Demands for unity, which of course has been a major reported theme of the RNC this week, are now mixing with online campaigns that are targeting individuals who shared offensive jokes about the shooting online. At least one person who's being targeted is now claiming that those screenshots are falsified and saying that they are scoping legal action. In any case, I think it's really just a reminder that we do not have impunity to say whatever we want on the internet, that this can be quite destructive, and that it's also something that can be used against us if we're not using good judgment online. Moving on. Let's zoom out a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about political violence in the United States, because I think this is not only a poorly understood term, but a term that has a lot of different definitions depending on our standpoint, our backgrounds, a lot of different things. So let's talk a little bit about what we might say political violence is. For one, political violence is not a category that's tracked in local or federal crime data. This is not something that our state institutions are looking at as a particular category. Definitions of political violence also differ pretty significantly between the different institutions that do specifically track political violence. So I am going to just ask you all to kind of think about some of these questions that are underneath that statement, and whether or not you would include hate crimes in political violence. Hate crime, of course, is also a term with no official unified definition. And maybe you can use the little Zoom emojis to put a hand up if this is something that you would apply to this. What about police shootings or aggressive police tactics at protests? To you, would that be political violence? What about a rising phenomenon that I think is a very serious concern, including here locally in our community, vigilante attacks on unhoused people? And what about US-backed violence around the world? Is that political violence? All right, well, moving on to the next slide. We are going to talk about an analysis that does not include any of those things in its definition of political violence, but which I still think is useful for context. So after consulting with a lot of different experts, a spring 2024 analysis put together by Reuters journalists used the following definition of political violence. All right. Incidents linked to an election or a partisan political dispute, note the word partisan, like they're narrowing that lens, or premeditated acts driven by an identifiable ideology. And look at what they are not including. They are not including hate crimes that they consider random, whatever that may mean when we're talking about hate crime, or violence involving police. This is the Reuters definition. Let's take a look at what they found using this particular definition on the next slide. So here are some key findings from that report, and I am going to grab the link and put it in for you so that you also have access to this, and you can also see what exactly they were talking about. And I think what's great about this is they have a lot of stories in here about essentially violence by neighbors toward their other neighbors, often based on something as simple as a rumor about someone's political affiliation, right? Some of their findings were that reported political violence began to spike in 2016. This, of course, was concurrently with the first Trump presidential campaign. And I'm sure a lot of you remember the warnings that a lot of folks had about the divisive and violent rhetoric that went along with that time period and the effects that it was having on our communities, which are, of course, ongoing. In contrast to some earlier waves of political violence that they also identified, like in the 1970s, back then, political violence appeared to be targeting mostly property. Today, people are the main target. And while some incidents do make national headlines, we could talk about the attack, for example, on Nancy Pelosi's husband. We could talk about the targeting of election workers after the 2020 election for very racist reasons and in an attempt to discredit free and fair election results. A lot of these contemporary incidents of political violence do not get that big spotlight. They're occurring between neighbors. They're occurring against local, civic, or elected leaders. People who do not have that same level of national spotlight, right? Next slide, please. And crucially, I think for us to understand, because right now, movements for justice have been in the focus and have been blamed for potentially contributing to the assassination attempt against former President Trump. Here you can see the Reuters take on the ideologies between 18 fatal political attacks that occurred since the Capitol riot. And I think this graph really speaks for itself in terms of where we are seeing this coming from. So let's go to the next slide. Because the Reuters analysis did exclude out hate crime in a couple different ways, I wanted to also point you all to this really useful and good report by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. It is called Cause for Concern 2024, and it offers some detail on reported hate crimes. So I'm also always saying reported as I'm speaking about these things, because there is a large amount of these kinds of violence that are never reported. And I'm sure that many of us are aware of potential incidents of political violence or of unreported hate crimes that we know of from our networks, from our own experience, right? We're really relying here only on what people reported. And in the case of hate crime, we're also relying on how often local prosecutors defined a particular incident, which is, of course, very much a sliding scale based on differences in state laws, based on different philosophies towards how do state agencies pursue these crimes, right? So there's also a giant asterisk on a lot of these numbers. However, what we do know from these reports is that reported hate crimes in the United States have increased by more than 80% since 2015. And let's compare that with the Reuters investigation finding that political violence has increased quite a bit since 2016, right? We're talking, I think, about two aspects of the same phenomenon here. Reported hate crimes have also spiked in the last 4 presidential election years. I think in the Spokane area, we have a little bit of insight into how this happens because our major local election year was 2023. And many of you probably remember the wave of homophobic and transphobic vandalism, the stealing of pride flags off of people's porches, the destruction of public art that symbolizes LGBTQ plus inclusion, the attempts to intimidate local businesses and local LGBTQ plus organizations that have a visible presence in some of those same neighborhoods. I think a lot of us instinctively knew that with tensions rising and this big political decision that we had to make for our local community, there's likely a correlation there. What the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights is saying is that this also holds at the national level, and that holds particularly in these presidential election years. Also, importantly, by far, not all hate crimes are committed by members of identifiable organized groups. However, hate crimes that are committed by members of organized bigoted groups also spike in presidential election years. And I could see this a lot in the reasons that many of you put into the chat as to why you are here, because you know that the temperature is rising, I suppose, in more ways than one with the heat wave that we are seeing this week. We know that when these tensions rise, it has a very real effect on our communities, and we know that people take it out on members of marginalized groups and people who experience discrimination. So there, I think, is a little bit of an overview of, first of all, what we can actually say and what we cannot actually yet say about the incident involving President Trump, former President Trump, in which one person was killed in the audience. There is a little bit of context in terms of how can we wrap our heads around this term political violence and around the different ways that we are going to define that based on our values in this community, based on our outlook, based on the ways that we understand vigilante violence, state violence, systemic violence, all of these different forms in which we mistreat each other and in which people have to face violence. And a little bit of a detour because bigoted violence and hate crime can sometimes be defined out of political violence as to how that plays into the picture. I now want to talk a little bit about what we can do. So let's go to the next slide. First of all, I think it's really important to talk about the ways that our collective reactions are shaped by the pressures that we feel for an instant reaction in an age of social media in which mass communication happens on platforms where we all have some kind of voice. And there is that pressure to say something, right? Often with saying something, standing in symbolically for doing something. These are not the same thing, but we're often pressured to engage in these speech acts, to make up our minds quickly, to be first to a story, to just doom scroll and look for little potential snippets of information that could tell us more. What this tells us is that we should be paying close attention to our sources. And when we share, we should do that in context and we should do that with care. Because we have to imagine ourselves, I think, as not just sitting alone in a room when we're reacting to these things online. We're kind of all in the same room. It's kind of as if we all piled into a high school gymnasium and started yelling in each other's faces, right? Like that's the emotional experience that I think a lot of us are having. And that slowly can shape the way that something is perceived overall. So first of all, I want to say it's very, very normal for conspiracy theories to circulate after a high-profile incident. At Western State Center, we monitor these things, we analyze them. I know that we do often identify the immediate move to conspiracy with our political opposition, but this is also just a cognitive trick that our brains will play on us in order to try and make a confusing emerging reality fit into our existing worldview. We want to make that fit in. We might be worried that something could be happening that might destabilize our beliefs. And maybe the least destabilizing thing is to assume, as I heard in an airport where I was trapped during a power outage as this news was breaking, people around me, that was one of the first reactions within the first 10 minutes is, could this have been staged? Now that we know more details, I think it's quite clear that while this is not an incident any of us would think of as being probable or likely, something like this has not happened for decades in quite this form, right? If I'm trying to think about whether or not something happened as it has been presented, I try to imagine all of the logistical steps that would go into faking it. And in this case, given what we know about law enforcement not quite being on top of things in the way that they perhaps should have, coordination issues, all of these different things, I think it's quite clear how at one of hundreds of campaign appearances in this particular situation, something really truly slipped through the cracks. We live in a world of randomness where a lot of different things happen, and a lot of them are very low probability. So that's kind of my take on that. I would also just say that as news breaks of something really surprising and difficult to understand, we do not have to participate in the outpouring of conspiracy theories that are automatically going to come immediately after an incident like this. We can sit back and wait. We can tell ourselves, you know, this is really strange. This is a wild situation. This is such a bizarre historical event for us to be living through, but I'm gonna wait and see if there's more information forthcoming before I jump to any conclusions. Along with that, I think it's important to keep in mind that details do tend to emerge slowly. It takes time for us to get a picture of what's happening. It takes time for journalists to figure things out. It takes time for this true picture to emerge. And as always, there is just no shame in saying, I don't know, instead of risking potentially spreading false or unclear information to people in your network. If you are someone who knows that you are listened to on social media, or even if you're just one voice in that gigantic chorus, it's particularly important to get comfortable with saying, hey, I don't know. I'm not sure what's going on. I don't think anyone's sure what's going on. Let's wait. Let's sit back and wait for things to come out. One thing that's also changed pretty rapidly in the past couple of years, and that I think has changed a lot of the dynamics on social media and in these spaces where we're trying our best to share information and gather information as fast as we can and understand what's happening as quickly as we can, is that there are new dynamics when it comes to monetization on some of these platforms, and that is driving an increased spread of misinformation. So let me briefly just explain how that works. And I think one of the main bad actors here is Twitter, or I guess X, if that's how you feel about it. So I'm going to use that as an example. A little blue check on that platform used to mean that this is the person who has verified, or an organization, a person or organization who has verified their identity. That if there's a blue check next to the name Kate Bitz, that's my actual profile. Or if there's a blue check next to the Peace and Justice Action League, it's actually the Peace and Justice Action League. That is no longer the case. That blue check is something people can purchase. Along with that subscription purchase, people have the option now to monetize their content based on views, shares, and clicks. What this means is that it has created a monetary incentive for some people to sign up for a subscription, spend a little money, and begin saying anything or everything online that they think will go viral. And we know from years of studies on social media that what tends to spread the most quickly is anything that's particularly inflammatory. So let me give one small example of what I was seeing on Twitter directly after this shooting. We've all seen the photo of former President Trump holding up a fist. Someone posted that picture and said, wow, like this is the hardest picture of all time. Like, look at this amazing picture. That person had a blue check. Their profile was monetized. Other folks, not realizing this, said, absolutely not. And they started to post their own pictures that they thought were so much cooler. Like, this picture of this other political leader is so much cooler. No, look at this picture from a concert of my favorite music artist. Like, that is so much cooler. They thought that they were basically dunking on this person, and they thought that they were refuting this point. What they were doing was making this person money. And you can imagine that gets so much worse when it is someone falsely claiming, like the New York Post did, that this shooter was a Chinese American person, or someone posting a picture of a trans woman who bears some superficial resemblance to pictures we've seen of the shooter and saying, oh, look, here's who is really behind this, right? It gets so much worse when it is spreading offensive or bigoted characterizations of the situation, mischaracterizations of what happened, etc. So this is definitely a dynamic that I think we just have to be aware of, because every single time that a new shocking piece of news breaks, this is something that we're going to see again. Let's go to slide 16 for a little more. Another thing that I think is really important when it comes to this particular situation is just not to take that bait of self-blame as a response to specious claims. Discussing very real threats to democracy and community safety, that is not violent language. And I know Trump said that from the stage of the RNC last night. He also said a lot of other things that were nonsense, right? What we're talking about when we are saying that democracy is in danger, that our communities are in danger, is all of the things that I just laid out for you in terms of these statistics gathered by Reuters, gathered by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, to show that when bigoted language and ideas spread rapidly, that has an effect. When our ability to protest and engage in civil disobedience is being restricted by the Supreme Court, by our local law enforcement agencies, right? All of that has an effect. And it makes it harder for us to raise our voices. It makes it harder for us to have a robust civic life and a robust democracy. So what we're not talking about there is some kind of violent response to that that would further degrade civil society, that would put more people in danger. That is not what we're talking about. I would also just say, in addition to that, when we are discussing these kinds of violent events, it's incredibly important to ground our statements in our and our community's values. So let's talk about what this means, not just for one person, but for our fears of what could happen next. Let's talk about what we can do to push back on it and to stem this tide of political violence, because we are members of the body politic. None of this happens without our silence. None of this happens without our consent. And collectively, we do have the power to operate differently than that. Lastly, too, as we're kind of talking about these discussion spaces, I would just say it is okay to log off. You are not the press secretary of a national organization. You don't have to make a statement. If you are part of a community group, and if you are thinking about making a statement, that is great, but do not feel obligated. Take a step back and ask yourself, is this something that I need to add to? Is this my moment to speak? Can I amplify other people that I agree with instead? Is it even important for me to be talking about this online, or is it more important for me to be talking about this maybe with close friends or family where I know that I have some influence in these discussions that really matter, in these connections that are actually crucial in real life? And let's have one more slide, please. And lastly, I'm sure this suggestion is also not a surprise to you. This is the Peace and Justice Action League event, and this is a speaker from Western States Center. But in that vein, what is most important, I think, at this moment is to get organized. Continuing to work towards justice in your local community is going to have a larger impact than anything you can do online. Continuing towards our goals of participating in civic life, of keeping that window open for a more inclusive democracy, all of that is going to be much more important than our reaction to any one particular event. So do not let yourself get knocked off course by all of this. I would also say, we have seen elected officials in the past week speaking out against political violence. That is meaningful. It's a meaningful part of the discussion, and we can thank them for that. We can also hold them accountable if they are not being consistent in their opposition to political violence. When Marjorie Taylor Greene is, on the one hand, fundraising for January 6th defendants who participated in an extremely high-profile event of political violence, and on the other hand, saying this violence has to stop, we do not have to take that at face value. We can ask what is going on there, and we can point out in the future when these politicians are not living up to the lofty claims that they have made in the last week. We can also join up with community efforts to stand up for a free, fair, and nonviolent election year. We just talked about some of the election year dynamics that make a year like 2024 especially perilous for people who might be the targets of hate incidents and hate crimes. Our community is also fairly well organized around, for example, pressuring our local elected officials to educate the public on what voter intimidation is, making sure that we are talking to each other about the risks that we see that come along with this election year, and working to make sure that people feel safe in going to vote, in going to drop off their ballot, all of these different things. Of course, it is summer, so those efforts will be ramping up in the coming months. But I think it's really crucial to have broad participation in those efforts. So if you have concerns that you haven't aired, if you have an idea that you'd like to share with a group like Pijals, I think that's very important. And I would really urge you to get involved in all of that. Yeah, that is what I have for you today. I realize some of that may have raised more questions than it answered, but that is a sign of the times. And I'm not here to give you false certainty about certain things that we just don't know yet. I'm especially not here to give you any foregone conclusions about what's going to happen next, because the fact is we decide what happens next. As Scott Nakagawa's piece that Liz just quoted says, we are the ones who decide how we act. We're members of the body politic. Political violence is something that concerns us, and it's also something that we have a voice in preventing and in stopping. So thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to take some questions. Liz, I would suggest maybe we could turn off the recording at some point in Q&A just to make sure that everyone can get their question in, even if they're uncomfortable with that. But yeah, let's hear from folks, and thank you all again so much for being here.